Good evening, everyone. I acknowledge that wherever we are in Australia, we stand on the traditional lands of Aboriginal people. I recognise the traditional custodians of these lands and the continuing connection to land, culture, community and story, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Here at Hornsby, we are on the lands of the Dyarubbin Guringai peoples, and I invite you to recognise the custodians of the country you are on. Please sit back and relax, and if you have any questions for Grace, I encourage you to type them into the Q&A box on your screen. Please include your name and location so we know where our audience is coming from, and we'll leave some time for your questions towards the end of the discussion. My name is Mariko Smith, and I'm a Yuin woman and local Hornsby Shire resident. With me tonight is Grace Karskens, Professor of History at the University of New South Wales, and we'll be discussing her exciting new book, People of the River, Lost Worlds of Early Australia. I'm really excited to say that we've got over 275 people booked in tonight, which is amazing. And I would like to thank Library for promoting, as well as Hornsby Area Residents for Reconciliation and Local Reconciliation Group, who've been promoting this event as well. And Grace has signed some copies of her book at Novella Fine Books in Wahroonga, but it is available at all good bookstores and also your local library. So just wanted to start off, Grace, the river you focus on here is Dyarubbin, known commonly today as the Hawkesbury-Nepean River. And the people you refer to here in your book are those who have been traditional owners and custodians here since time immemorial, and those who came more recently, and with both these groups calling this place home. Dyarubbin has experienced early contact and conflict between the local Aboriginal peoples, who are namely the Dyarubbin people to the west, the Darkinjung to the north, and the Gundungurra people to the south, and the colonisers from the 1790s, so not long after the first fleet arrived in 1788, with the New South Wales colony fast expanding across and beyond the Sydney Basin. So we're looking here at the first wave of colonisation and its effects on Aboriginal country, culture and community. The fact that land was stolen from Aboriginal people, the whitefellas also started taking away Aboriginal children during this early colonial period, and there were massacres. And I note that the first recorded massacre of Aboriginal people was not at Mile Creek in 1838, as many commonly assume, but Grace, as you say, it in fact happened in Duroburn.
That's right, Mariko.
So in 1794, I believe. So
yeah. And this book is really about that very old history of Duroburn, the old human history reaching back 50,000 years, but also what happened when those first white ex-convict settlers arrived. And because that's the focus, and soil is really the focus here, it's the alluvial soils that both peoples needed and fought over. And you're absolutely right, the other conflict, of course, is about assaults on women and also the taking of Aboriginal children. I think in some ways that was the worst of all.
Because a lot of people think that stolen generations happened much later on, but in fact, from reading your book, we know that it happened pretty much from
day one.
Day one.
Yeah. Unfortunately, yes. I want to try and make that real for readers. We hear a lot about stolen generation. It's like it glides off us now, but we have to think about the impact of that. And of course, you say it happened in the 20th century as well. But from 1788, ordinary people stole Aboriginal children all the time, and a whole generation were growing up on white farms while their parents were desperate to get them back. If you can just imagine that in your family, if you lost a toddler, someone stole your child and refused to give it back, that's what it was like for them.
This is unimaginable. Before I read your book, I'd assumed that with Macquarie's Native Institution, that was probably the first wave of of the stolen generation, but that's like in the 1810s. So this is much earlier. You're talking about a period much earlier.
Yeah, that's right. It was that would be the first officially condoned. I mean, he sent soldiers out to take children. Mind you, he only wanted good-looking ones for his school. So I know history is sometimes gross and funny at the same time. But yeah, it was an ongoing tradition, and one of the big themes in the book is how did Aboriginal people deal with that? How did they keep in touch with their children? Because they did. And how did they deal with it in a kind of spiritual and cosmological way? And it's one of the main topics of the last chapter, is how they dealt with it.
Yes, I was going to ask, it segues really nicely into talking about the spiritual dimension, about how Aboriginal people adapted to colonisation and, demonstrating that resilience about coping and such. Just reading through really horrific things happening on this frontier, and how it affected the Aboriginal family unit, families, parents and their children, as well as the broader community as well. And I guess the devastating impacts of that are still felt very much today.
Yes. Yes, I mean, psychologists now think that you can inherit trauma, and I wonder about that. I almost don't want to believe it, because I want to believe everyone's got a fresh start, but perhaps they're right, that weight of trauma is inherited down the generations. But I also wanted to show what you mentioned, the resilience and the fact that some settlers tried to get on with Aboriginal people, shared their food with them, shared their crops with them, learnt language. It's just that others had guns and formed posses and committed massacres. So it's a really complex story. It's more than just white people fighting black people, because there was a lot of crossing over as well. This is an intimate frontier zone.
Yes.
There's a lot of crossing over. There's a lot of crossing over of artefacts and food and spiritual beliefs as well, which brings us to the fact that the Aboriginal culture isn't unchanging or timeless, or it changes all the time, but it remains Aboriginal. I always think of it like a fabric coming out of a loom with more threads added, but it's still the same fabric. That is very much, in a very simple way, what happened here. So that explains how it was that they could survive. What happened to them?
Yes, because that's a really important message, because I think too many people believe that particularly in this area in the southeast, this highly colonised, urbanised, in the Sydney region, that Aboriginal culture is it's dead, it's weak, it's fake, where just that adaptation is really key. And that's something that our people, we have over tens of thousands of years have adapted to all sorts of climatic conditions, but also now the social changes, particularly the massive upheaval caused by from 1770 really onwards. I know we had that gap between Cook coming in 1770, then 18 years later with the first fleet. It's just really interesting. Like, the culture comes back. I mean, I know that was the intention of colonisers, was to kill the people off, through dispersals and massacres. And then when they found that they failed in doing that, they tried to kill us through culture. But the culture always, as you say, comes back. And it's really great to read in your book about how Aboriginal people did not disappear. They have survived to continue to live on the river. So,
today, yes. I think the last time I counted is at least 6,000 people up and down in the local government areas, including this one.
Yes. It's very vibrant and active community.
And there are people from elsewhere too, but like everyone's adopted countries, they're learning about it. So we're really in an interesting phase at the moment, as you all know.
That's it. And my own research is interested in adaptation, resilience, and cultural resurgence. So your book really speaks to me on the about cultural, and also we'll talk a little bit later about the language revitalisation. But I particularly would like you to talk a little bit about one of the people you discuss in the book, which really talks about this cultural dynamism. I hope I said that word right. I'm trying to practice that. But with Nadung's account.
Yes. Yeah. Well, there's a number of characters in this book, real people, that I was able to put together a life story for. I can say that quickly. I can't tell you how hard it is to do that, because these are not rich, well-known people that everybody published about. They're the ordinary people, and of all the ordinary people, Aboriginal people are the least recorded. And so with Nadung, she was born about the time or just before her country around Penrith was invaded, and I was able to over about 10 years piece together her life story. And she made a friend called Sarah Shand in the 1880s, And this is very lucky for us because Sarah Shand, although she didn't understand what she was writing mostly, wrote down what Nuttall said. And Nuttall could remember what it was like when the first white people came, invaded, and it was interesting what she said. She said, a lot of black fellas, not many white fellas, and the forest was still full of food. So, and when I checked out that early history, she was right. It was quite slow where she was, and they couldn't cut down the forests immediately. So there's a bit of a lag time where Aboriginal people had a bit more time to adjust than in many other stories, and that may explain the resilience as well, because the forests were still intact, 70% intact in the 1820s still. Yes. And so it's still going around. So it's it's a long dispossession. It's a slow dispossession. Those early farmers couldn't farm more than about 10 acres. So they were like little patches in the forest. Yes. Which means the forest is still there, which means people could still live in the forest and forage and still get to their water places and their ceremonial grounds. So one thing I would like people to understand is the model where the settlers come and the Aboriginal people disappear and suddenly the landscape changes is completely wrong. That is not what happened. And I've been able to, and that's why the environmental history is very important. Yes. Because we really can't understand anybody's experiences unless we look at what environment they are living in. And that means water and forests and air and floods,
it's all the integral ecology, isn't it?
Yeah, it's all integral. So, and these people both groups of people depend on soils and water, but soils especially because they both need carbohydrate foods, which are grown in those beautiful Hawkesbury alluvials. That's why they had the land rush there with all the people rushing out there.
It's because it's arable land.
Absolutely, yeah.
So this leads really nicely into what I was hoping to lead to about, looking at the different ways of seeing and belonging to Dyarubbin. So, like with the the fact that Aboriginal cultural heritage is not just about artefacts or things, it also covers, whole areas, including landforms, animals and plants. These are all culturally significant. And it was very clear for you, you've got a very beautiful narrative writing style. Like it reads just so beautifully. For instance, the way you describe how the great eel being Gurungati, he tore apart through the stone heart of the mountains in the dreaming in the area around Dyarubbin. So that's how, it's great for me as a local resident to go, oh, that's, it just explains so much about the whole landscape and how everything is explained by the dreaming. And I think that's something really important for non-Indigenous people to, understand that as well. And you've got this lovely story about the waving seam of iron ore. You wanted to share that with us all. That was
a revelation to me. So this is why it's important to walk on country and preferably with Aboriginal people if you possibly can. I was trying to understand a way of writing about Aboriginal people's idea of time and also nature and culture. So this is a good example. So I was with Darug colleagues that I'm working with in a beautiful rock shelter way up north of Mangrove Creek, and it was full of painted eels. And one of my colleagues found a beautiful wavy line of iron ore. And a non-Aboriginal person with it said, well, that's natural. That's not part of the painting. And of course, that's irrelevant because the artist would have seen that seam of iron ore waving and would have seen that was left there in the dreaming by the ancestors. Nothing is natural. Everything is cultural because all those landforms, the great rock tiers, the great gorges, as you just mentioned, which are very common as you get sort of from Sackville down, were created by ancestral beings. So coming into the eel cave, that artist would have thought, eel pattern, of course, that's what this cave is about. The ancestors have left this here. And it was just an awakening for me because, we're taught to see culture and nature as different things. Yes. And that's not so in Aboriginal thinking.
No, it's very much a Western way of thinking where everything's kind of compartmentalised and there's neat little categories, yet everything's so intertwined. It's like a cycle. I'm trying to say that word, cyclical.
Cyclical, yeah. No, you're right. It is cyclical. That's
not a very cyclical way to say it, but yes. But yeah, so just that way is all intertwined and connected, where people are part of, country is, it basically defines us all. It's not the other way around where humans are at the very top of the apex, whereas country is really everything. But it's interesting that the Europeans also saw significance in this landscape as well. So they saw, didn't see it as Dyarubbin, they saw it as the Hawkesbury-Nepean, as the Nile of New South Wales.
Yes, don't you love that?
I know, so that's a very interesting way of, where they think about civilization, and it says so much, doesn't it? And the granary of the colony, so you can see right there, like there's a lot of economic significance about the colony, and I think that's something that we're reading more into now. It's like there were very strategic reasons for the selection of New South Wales as a colony for Great Britain.
And for convicts,
And for convicts, yes. And so it was the first successful white farming frontier and a proving ground for colonial agriculture and free-range grazing. So what do you think this, you can see it really does lead into what Australia is today?
Yeah, I think so, except this is a forgotten chapter. I mean, I know probably listeners will agree, but most people's idea of convicts are hopeless, faceless people who didn't do anything, who wore pyjamas with arrows on them. If we just kind of forget that image for early Sydney, I'm not saying that the later period after the 1820s was very difficult for convicts, it was much harsher. But in that early period, these people had been banished from Great Britain and chucked out of their homelands, but they were heading for a colony that was meant as a colony for them. And they never forgot that. I mean, even when the free settlers started pouring in the 1820s and 30s, they said, what are you doing here? This is our colony, our colony. And it was kind of, the idea was to give them land grants after the expiration of their sentence. So 30 acres of Great River land, do you think any of them would have had an opportunity to have land back where they came from? These people were on, they weren't the bottom of the heap because they weren't the absolute poor people, but they'd been convicted, tried and banished, exiled from their country, which is a terrible punishment for anyone. All their country, all their friends, all their family.
Who would have known? Like the whole sort of worldview.
No. But what they did bring with them was another old tradition. So we tend to think of settlers as bringing the new, the modern. These people are very old-fashioned. And the ones I'm looking at come from the rural areas. They bring with them old traditions of commoning, because a lot of Britain had been for hundreds of years commons. And commons are just common areas, a bit like Crown land now, no fences, and everybody could use it to support themselves. And of course, that had been belted back by enclosure over the centuries. And these people also brought with them traditions of resisting enclosure. They hated fences. They didn't fence their farms, and they free-range grazed their cattle in bush. They didn't fence them off either, and they used the bush and the lagoons for hunting. And that's why Dyarubbin was regarded as a paradise, because it was chock full of food. Ducks in their millions, every kind of water bird you could imagine. And then you have the crops just growing without much attention because the soil was so rich. So no wonder these exiled people that had been chucked out of their country, that went through the virtual death of transportation, they see themselves as reborn in a new country, and it's another chance at life. And a lot of them start families if they can find a partner, and it means everything to them. Everything, and yet it's predicated on chucking out, dispossessing and hurting another group of people, the Aboriginal people. And they knew that once they got there, because Aboriginal people were everywhere, and it's something they had to deal with when they were there.
It was like the uncomfortable truth staring them in the face.
Yeah, I know. But on the other hand, they're not willing immigrants, they're forced immigrants. So it's a little bit more murky than just saying you shouldn't be here because you're an invader. They were forced to come here. So. And as the granary of a colony, you're absolutely right. Governors were very worried until then about where the grain supplies were going to come from to support this growing colony. And those ex-convict farmers created grain security by 1795. So again, there's a myth about convict farmers being hopeless drunks. Well, they did drink a lot, that's true. There's a chapter on that.
Yep.
But they were the ones who actually put the colony on a stable footing in terms of grain supplies, wheat and corn.
And, you know, they were active to that vision of what a free country was supposed to be, you know, a nation of small farmers, you know, that sort of vision of an ideal Rome, you know, like that's what an honest sort of, you know, nation is kind of built upon these sort of foundations. So
well, that's right, and that small farming ideal stayed with us right through the 19th century with selection and then close settlement, and after World War I and even after World War II, we still had that idea that of the man with his family on the land, earning an honest living and becoming reformed. That was the whole idea that was supposed to work for the convicts. And you know what? It kind of did. It did work.
So yes, like you said, it's like you know, the Hawkesbury-Nepean areas into Dyarubbin became the last bastion of 18th century ways of life and thinking. And so, you know, as an ethnographic historian, I think you explain that just so, just so beautifully through all the various stories and various characters that you bring out throughout the chapters. And I see, you know, it says so much about the building of the nationhood, what we see today as, you know, Australia. So in terms of like, particularly with that generation, the one after, you know, they were born here, so they're white, what they call the white native born.
They call themselves the white native born.
Yep, as opposed to the black native people.
Yes, exactly.
It's interesting, and then you've got the currency lads and lasses, and later on, you know, Henry Lawson through the Bulletin, you're talking about that whole, because it all became later on part of, you know, separating the identity away from Great Britain and the, you know, the mother country to really developing an own Australian identity. So
yeah, it's pretty early.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that currency generation, currency lads and lasses, were a very proud, strong, patriotic, what's the word I'm looking for, group of people. But they got their backs up because when the free settlers started to arrive, they felt they had to have the upper hand and put them down. So they you know, colonial was inferior, colonial was this, colonial was that. And if you have convict parents, of course, that was
the convict staying.
That was convict staying, not originally, but later because of the free settlement. So it's a really complex story, and the cultural story is really important. And you're right, it does carry on through the generations. Yeah,
because I think just like from the socioeconomic side, looking at, you know, class analysis as well, it's just really fascinating when you get beyond the sort of cultural aspect of, like, yes, it's about the class as well, and, you know, the idea of the convicts is to pioneer other and all these different groups, because I personally didn't realise it was, that there's so many different groups, you can't just kind of bunch them all together. I wanted to ask you about gender, because I feel that, it's very gendered society on both sides, so both Indigenous and with the Europeans as well. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because I know you have an interest in
I sure do.
gender. Yep.
Yeah, I might talk about Aboriginal women, because often you'll find that in many accounts, it's always the Aboriginal people or the Aboriginal group or this particular group or that particular group. And people, you know, writers haven't really looked more carefully at the gendered roles that people had in Aboriginal society. And it turns out that, you know, they tend to gender male, you know. So warriors are gendered male and hunters are gendered male. Everybody's male. People who, you know, do fire management, male for hunting kangaroos. When I actually gleaned through all the sources, I didn't find a lot of information, because Aboriginal women, like my daughter, mostly get left out completely. You would almost think it's not worth doing, but I tell you what, it is worth doing, because I did find references and evidence, as I said, for women being the main food providers for their families and their clans, therefore. As was true in Sydney as well with the Eora fisherwomen. And there's lots of evidence of that, not in the writing, but in the artefacts. There are lots and lots of grinding stones that they would have used to create the foods that they did from all the yams, which were the carbohydrate, you know, food, staple food. But there's also evidence of women fighting the settlers, joining the raids to get rid of them, which was quite effective. They actually succeeded at one point for about 6 years. And then they also, I mean, you often get this stuff of like only this, these are male sacred sites and only men are allowed there. That can be true of some sites, but the connotation has been that women didn't share in sacred life. And wow, that is an absolute nonsense. In the first case, how can you have a society where one half doesn't have any sacred beliefs and the other half does? That is crazy, for starters. But there is scattered evidence to show that women have their own initiation ceremonies. They have their own sites, which some of the archaeologists have found, their own rituals. But there's good evidence that's just been ignored, that they had a really important part to play in the male initiation ceremony that everyone says is all male and women aren't allowed. And their special tool, the yam stick, is not only used to provide food, and it's a personal identifier, it's used in symbolic ways in those rituals and for fighting. Yeah, so women fought each other with their yam sticks.
Wow, yeah, but that's I hear from the first step of Barangaroo, really strong Aboriginal women at the time.
Absolutely.
I remember hearing a story, just a little bit off topic, but about Barangaroo where I think something was stolen from the women, and so I don't know if it was Philip, but one of the
governors, probably Philip.
Yeah, probably get Philip, and to set an example, saying I'm going to punish the person who did this and stole your property, and so they were flogging. They flogged the man, and the women were everyone was so upset because Aboriginal people just looked at that and went, that's just, that's not how we do things. And
they would have said that's savage.
That's savage, yes. And I think Barangaroo grabbed the whip out of the
flogger's hands.
Yep.
She did. Yeah, some people think she was unusual, but I think she was probably typical. These are not shrinking violets,
No,
they know what they know their culture, they know what they're about, and they're just full of confidence.
But the characterisation, I'm looking now into, how Aboriginal men have been characterised, and you can see the roots of all those stereotypes about Aboriginal men that, are pervasive even to today, about lazy and violent.
Yeah.
I was reading, Kanishi's work about, the insolent male. You're looking at the early colonial records and seeing the myth about, that was a very convenient narrative for the colonisers to say that the Aboriginal men were the ones who were tormenting and the women, but what were white men doing to the women?
Exactly. So gender politics is really important in this whole story, as it is in any war. I mean, war and gender go together. We can't forget that.
Too.
Yeah.
Looking at gender and also with the fledgling settlers society with it's interesting, you're doing the ethnographies about the marriages and how the family units at the time. I was really struck by reading about the the shortage of women at the time led to these the marriages with you got these huge age gaps.
Yeah.
What are we talking about, Grace? What sort of age gaps were you looking at?
Well, it's quite common, and this isn't unusual in settler societies. It was quite common for women to marry at 14, 15, 16. I think and I can show that had to do, and show this in the book in the chapter on this, it had to do with the shortage of women. I mean, there's three men to every woman in the earlier years, and by the 1820s, I think it's 11 to 1, something ridiculous. And, those men from that later transportation period hardly any of them had a hope of getting married. And I wanted to just say how important marriage and having children was to ex-convicts, because that's part of putting your roots down in a new country, and it makes life worthwhile. And for a lot of men, especially, that was not going to be ever possible. So the story of the Hawkesbury, it does revolve around families on both sides. So you're right to point that out. And, the other thing about white women, the young white women, is they use that power. If they ended up with a fellow who was a bit of a dropkick.
Gender politics.
Yeah, absolutely. They would leave them for someone who's better.
Yes,
because they're in great demand. There are lots of stories like that. But then there's the desperate wanting of children, and a son. For men, they wanted to have sons, and there's evidence. There's quite a few examples where the men kind of get rid of their wives if they don't have any babies and try someone else, So it's pretty crude, but it's this kind of basic instinct or want to have children and to leave something behind, and I think that needs to be taken seriously.
Yeah, and also I think touching back on stolen children
Yeah.
with how, you have some of these couples who are childless, they adopted Aboriginal children, for various reasons, but one was because they genuinely wanted a child.
Wanted a child. Yeah, I do think, and I found some evidence, some couples were like that. Others are just, obviously it's a trophy, which is disgusting, or they wanted to bring them up as free workers. That never worked, because I also found out that Aboriginal parents kept in touch with their children somehow. They taught them language, they taught them who they were, which is why they returned to their own people when they became adolescents, because they had to be initiated.
Yes, and then the agency of the children as well, looking at the guerrilla nature of the warfare at the time, where I think there was one example, was it Mariko, who was brought up by a white couple, and he went up to lead some of those resistance efforts, and then in the white community, they're like, well, this is why we shouldn't bring these savages into our homes, because they will learn our weaknesses.
Yeah, well, they kept doing it though. It continued right over the 19th century. But the term was train them up, So, but once they got to be adolescents, they were pretty good at working out what the weaknesses were, and they often became the leaders of their clans when they reached adulthood. So they were initiated and they did know law. We've got a number of examples of that on Hawkesbury. So that's another way that resilience, you can see resilience, and you can also see how the Aboriginal families continued. And that's important to remember. They were reformed, but they did continue.
So just thoughts regarding how taking of land is the knotted wound at the heart of the modern nation. What these earliest white settlers on Dyarubbin did share with generations of free settlers who followed was this. They believed that the land was unowned and that they had the right to take it, to occupy, own, clear, farm, buy, and sell it. So throughout this book, you've told the intertwined histories of the Aboriginal and non-Indigenous people of the river. How do we address going forward on the two irreconcilable claim to sovereignty over country? This is the knotted wound at the heart of the modern nation. How can we move forward when, we are living on stolen land, and then you have, people who, are descended from these white settlers, and, how can they reconcile with that? And then I think with the whole project of reconciliation and truth-telling, how can we move forward?
I think a lot of people are asking the same question, and it's frustrating that we haven't been able to move forward. But I think that the Uluru Statement from the Heart is one of the most historic documents that we have, and also one of the most generous, because it does show a way forward, it shows a path forward. And the bit that I'm interested in as a historian is the truth-telling. So voice, treaty, truth, we need all of those things. But at the base of that, before we even start, we have to have truth-telling. We have to agree that there was this past, that this happened, and then we can move forward to Makarrata or reconciliation, whichever one you want to use. I have been inspired by my Deputy Vice-Chancellor Indigenous, Megan Davis at the University of New South Wales, who is a big history fan, yes. And, I think I was kind of tunneling my way blindly through this debate. I want to work at a regional level because I want to tell these detailed stories about how people actually lived and got on. But she said, truth-telling, she thought it really should progress on a regional level. So people get together, do the research, talk, listen, most importantly, listen, and then agree on that history. And that's a big project, but we've got to start somewhere.
That's it, and I really did like the local regional approach that Statement from the Heart was calling for, because everyone focuses so much on the federal government and national level, and it's yes, but we have to realise the other levels as well, and I'm a big believer in the grassroots and locals where things happen. And so that's another question I had was about your style as a historian, where typically a lot of histories are kind of built from the top down, but you're kind of going bottom up and using Dyarubbin as my focus. As your focus.
Yeah, because it's, I call it the Crucible of the colony because it was. I mean, it's where everything was tested, the first land rush, the first major long war, and the first place settlers and soldiers figured out how to fight that war in horrible ways.
Yes, right. Oh, I'm just not sure how we're going for time, but I've got like another question, and then we can lead into, I'm sure we've got quite a few questions coming through.
Yeah, I can see that. That's great. Thank you, everybody.
It's a little bit distracting to see, but yeah, like we'll definitely, yeah, so no, it's great. I'm really glad to see all these questions coming through, so I'll make sure that we'll leave plenty of time to address these, so no problem at all. But what I really wanted to lead into is, with Dyarubbin, the fact that we're calling it Dyarubbin, like it's just so just refreshing to be able to use that. I'm going to be trying personally to use that more day to day because, as an Aboriginal person, I'm a big believer in like speaking language to country. It just really, country's a living thing, and I just think language just takes it to that next level. And it responds to hearing these words that haven't been spoken for so long. So I try what I can, and just all these language words and lists that are featuring in your book, it's so generous that you included the language lists at the back as well. So it's fascinating reading about all the different plants and trees and how to call them in language. So you've got, Darug and Dark and Young and like the Sydney language. But, seeing these language words like Kolomata and Woolomarang, Williayurang, Marangora, Maroon-Marak, like to be able to speak these ancient names of these places we have known, like Kolomata being Blue Mountains and then with or Green Hills or Windsor as was later called, that was Williayurang.
That's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it?
It is, but that's the thing I love to it. It's a shame. It feels really bad that it's so foreign sounding to us, even though this is.
But these have just been discovered. That's not surprising.
Yeah.
These are just a newly discovered list.
So could you tell us about that?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'd love to.
2 ways into that.
Yeah. Thank you for reading those words. It's pretty special, isn't it?
I think it's really important for me. I just really wanted to be able to speak those words.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, this is the next project that I'm working on with a team of Dyarubbin researchers and artists and educational people. And it's based on an amazing find that I made in the Mitchell Library, my favourite place in the world, besides Hornsby Library right now. I was just doing some final research for my book and scrolling through a microfilm copy of the diary and papers of a Reverend John McGarvey, who was the incumbent at Pitt Town on the Hawkesbury in the late 1820s. And I'm just scrolling through and I come to a page headed List of Native Names for Places on the Hawkesbury. And there followed 5 pages with over 170 names.
That's never been found in the record.
I discovered later that some linguists had found it but not actually done anything with it or published it. So I was amazed. So to me it was a fresh find, and the linguist I'm working with, Jim Wafer, has been fabulous with this project. So I was so shocked after I picked myself off the floor because I had no idea that something like that was in the library. And I knew immediately that it was sort of riches beyond rubies.
There you go, kids. So libraries are places of magic where there's treasures.
This is magic. It's treasure. Because I'd so often thought, how can I write about this place if I don't know what the Aboriginal name was? So, you keep saying things like the place later known as Windsor, which is very clunky. Mm-hmm. So, as I said, after I picked myself off the floor because I was so shocked, I scrolled through and I noticed that McGarvey had actually included the farmers' names. And I recognise those names because I know where all the farmers were, and you can tell from the map, the early maps.
Yes.
So it suddenly occurred to me that we could put them back on the map, and that they could come back into use. We could do dual naming projects. So that was just a seed of an idea, and after a few months, it didn't go away, and I thought, I've really got to do this. So that's when I contacted Leanne Watson in the Dyarubbin Custodians, and they immediately, I think I got an email back in less than a second. And together we designed that project, and it was funded by the State Libraries Coral Thomas Fellowship, for which I will be eternally grateful. And we're mapping them, we're placing them in the context of history, archaeological sites, of which there are hundreds still extant on the river. The Aboriginal landscape is still there.
Definitely.
And also with the geological, as you're talking about, for the geological formation. And at the moment we're making a story map, which will be available, it's digital, it'll be available online, and there'll be essays online published on the Dictionary of Sydney, which is another one of my favourite projects. Plus there'll be academic articles, and it's one of those projects I think that's just going to grow and grow.
A gift that keeps on giving.
A gift that keeps on giving. Thank you, Reverend McGarvey. You're a champ.
Look to the heavens for that one.
Yeah.
So like the counter mapping of the river, like so including that archaeological, ecological, and historical, and it's spiritual. It's just everything, you know. Like it's
Well, we can gloss. Jim's
Wow.
helping us. Jim Wafer is helping us gloss the names, so we actually know what they mean. In a lot of cases, not all. Sometimes it's really tentative. We're not sure. But some of the names are showing up things like where the women were camping, where the widows were camping, where the old men camped, where the fighting grounds were. And so we're slowly getting back some idea of that original dense Aboriginal landscape. And it's just a gift to work with it. It's a gift to work with the Dyarubbin people I'm working with.
Yes, I noticed one of the questions that Abby is asking about, did you work with Aboriginal elders and historians in researching your book? So I thought this would be a really good point to address the involvement of the Aboriginal community.
Sure.
Your research and work.
Well, for Western Sydney, I have to say communities, because there's a lot. It is, it's a very complex society. As you would expect, Aboriginal people are not all the same. There are a lot of differences there, different backgrounds. But I have I'm just so honoured and privileged to be able to work with the Dyarubbin people that I've worked with, especially going on country. I think that's the most important thing. But they also are so excited about this project because, so much of the stories and the words disappeared and were destroyed. And so this is reconnecting them with parts of their culture that had been lost, which are now going to come back as part of this whole language resurgence thing.
Amazing.
Couldn't have come at a better time, really.
Well, that's it. And 2019 was the International Year of
Indigenous
Languages.
I know.
Yeah.
Isn't that incredible? Like that happened as well. So it's pretty exciting.
Yes, and I mean, it says so much about Aboriginal identity and culture, like going from the present into the future to like the fact that we're still here and we're still practicing culture, connecting with country, and yes, things have changed. Like obviously, you got this big urbanisation where you lose sight of these ridge lines and all the sort of the way country looks. I feel like I'm walking around half blind in a way because I just feel like you don't see a lot of. It's just not in plain. I guess it's hidden in plain sight in a way. But yes, I just feel like don't see everything like it was. I'd love to be able to kind of travel back and see what the landscape looked like in pre-1788. So and with the place names, you reclaim some of that knowledge of country from that too.
Well, that's right, and a lot of the sites are still on the river is a place where you can see country in spite of the 200 years of farming. Settler farming, of course.
Yes.
Aboriginal people farming as well. But especially the lower Hawkesbury, that would be a great project for someone to do. Someone out there. Oh,
come on, the next book. We'll book you in for the author.
It would be, because you really can see those yawning cliffs, as you mentioned, that were created by Gurungati.
Yes.
Or one of his relatives, we're not quite sure. And he's engraved along the shorelines, and some of the names we have on the list refer to him or her. We don't know if it's him or her.
And
so yes, you can
as
see
the eagle beings. I was reading about that.
Eagle beings, they've been found in Wongai, which was, the archaeologists think that was one of the last meeting grounds for all the different groups of people, because part of this story is that people came together and languages ran together and shared words. It's not about boundaries and this is this culture and that's that culture. A lot of it is flowing between all the time. That's what keeps it alive.
That's it. But I've got an idea for the name for next week. Would be more people.
More people
of the river.
More people of More River.
Yeah. People of the river.
Thanks, Mariko.
We can write together.
I'm exhausted from that book.
So I thought we could start maybe weaving in some of these great questions that are coming through. So just reading through here. So we've got Jane who said, I love the fact that your book has added a depth of understanding to the place where I live. The Hawkesbury is such a beautiful area. I live near the lower end where there is still much bushland and national parks, a real paradise. And on my frequent walks here, I think about the original inhabitants a lot and see evidence of them in ubiquitous middens and occasional engravings and paintings. My question for Grace is there any record of the water quality when Philip first explored the river? Now it's always muddy. I mean, water quality is such a big issue for people living in this area.
Of course, yeah. Look, I don't think Philip actually noted the water quality, but you could be pretty sure that it was pristine. Possibly during floods there would have been a lot of turbidity, and we know that because every flood brought layers and layers of sand and layers of silt, muddy silt. So it would have been turbid then, but on the whole, I think the water quality would have been great. We've got some water names on our Mugabe list, some saying where the fresh water started, where the salt water starts. So, and those are also important shifting places for Aboriginal people as well. So that's really interesting. But yeah, I do understand. I think some of the environmental studies that have been done would tell you more, even more, about the history of the river's water. Very important topic.
So we've got interest from Karen about, can you describe a yam stick? What it looks like? Super interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, I want to imagine how they use it for fighting and.
Yes. Well, I'm lucky because the Hawkesbury Regional Gallery has a magnificent set of women's yam sticks, and that's where I figured out what they look like. They are about 4 or 5. I'm talking old measurements, but 5 feet. People still know what that means. Maybe 4, and each one was decorated or carved with the owner's individual motifs. So they were individualized tools and weapons. They were round-ish, very stout hardwood, and they could be sort of chiseled at one end, so a chisel point, excellent for shoving in the ground, shaking and pulling up yams, and decorative with a handle at the other end. They are the most beautiful things.
So there's a question for Peter about renaming as part of truth telling. So I think we touched on this a bit before, but yes, it's what could other communities, I think Dangar Island is named here, but like, you know, what could other communities take away from a project like this? I mean, it'd be great if we could have a Reverend Mugabe list kind of flutter out of the air. But,
they're everywhere, yeah.
Everywhere.
I'm so sorry, the Mugabe list did not come past Wiseman's Ferry. Wollongong. Thank you.
Yeah, what communities do, yeah.
Well, so I've just noticed that you do have a lot more Aboriginal names on maps at this end of the river than back at Windsor, and I think there are historical reasons for that. I won't go into it. So you could work on those with linguists. You could figure out, hopefully, what they mean. And yeah, launch dual naming projects, which are very long and complicated, I understand, from talking to people who've done them, but worth it. The next thing, which I hadn't actually thought about until someone asked me about it in Bathurst, I was talking in Bathurst a couple of nights ago, is how do you get people to use those names?
Yes.
I mean, like-minded people will use them, but the people in Bathurst found that nobody was using them. So that's a bit depressing, and I hadn't actually thought about it.
They've got Walu, they've got...
Walu, yeah,
Walu,
but no one says Walu.
Because everyone thinks Mount Panorama.
Yeah, they do.
So I think it's just about changing people's... Yeah, I mean, it's all part of that, like, you know, unpacking and dismantling a way that we've all kind of been, you know, indoctrinated or brainwashed, I guess, to a certain extent for the education system where we think the Western way. And so...
It's automatic. I mean, place
automatic.
names are embedded from industrial childhood, but I don't think that means we can't change.
Exactly.
Or we can't know both. I think, look, honestly, the response I've had in all the talks that myself and the Dyarubbin have done has been tremendous. Most, you know, people who I know with Christians were converted probably, but you can usually hear a pin drop when we talk about it. And there is a groundswell, I think, of interest in this and a true kind of longing to learn things.
I think so, and I think with this, there's opportunities there, and I think there is that interest. But using that as an opportunity to, you know, go further too with the truth telling and the reconciling.
Well,
with
it's kind of decolonising our landscape.
It is.
Yeah, that's what we're hoping to do with the map. It's
That's amazing.
counter map. It's an upside down map showing what's really there underneath. The real secret river.
Yes, the real secret river. Yes, well, there are questions about, I think maybe we should go into that about, you know, the secret river. People know, you know, Cape Grenville's secret river.
Yeah,
So, yeah, so like, you know, I guess, how does this work kind of fit in with that, you know, everyone is very familiar, it's a very popular book.
Mm. Yes, it is a very popular book.
Play and, you know,
and play and
yes.
TV show.
Yes.
And it was, I'm sure Kate Grenville wrote it with the kindest of intentions, but the problem is, she says herself, she deliberately didn't engage with Aboriginal culture at all. And the problem with that is you are going to put your own ideas in there because there's a vacuum. She does have Aboriginal characters, but she portrays them in ways that are, well, not flattering. So, but, you know, and people will know this from the story because you'll know it very well. But I think the main problem that Aboriginal people have with it is that the massacre, which didn't, you know, it's a massacre taken from another time in history and pasted onto the Hawkesbury. And in the massacre, everybody is killed. Everybody is killed. There's nobody left except one person who is a sad, depressed person at the end of the book. That is not even possible. And it's problematic because it allows non-thinking, non-Aboriginal people to say to Aboriginal people, you were all killed, you can't be Aboriginal. And they've got to fight that every day of their lives, all the time. You're not authentic, you're not really Aboriginal.
Oh, yes, I completely, I can say from personal experience, yes.
All the time.
And
but
then,
the massacre story helps with the idea that there aren't any Aboriginal people. And I mean, it's impossible to kill everybody anyway in a massacre. Massacres are dreadful, but they don't wipe out 100 people who live in a clan or something. So I think that's the problem with the book and the play and the film.
And the characterisation of Aboriginal people where like they struggle even just to pronounce English names where
that's just it is cringingly bad.
I was like, oh, all he does is say formula.
It's terrible, I know. And they are superb linguists who pick up English very well and very particular in every meeting to learn everybody's name and say them perfectly. That is recorded over and over again, you know, and it's not hard to find out. So yeah, I mean, I think it was well meant. It's had a huge impact. A lot more people are much more aware of our history, our true history, but it does have these problems, which I'm hoping we can kind of
go through. But I mean, yeah, getting people interested in history. I mean, if it opens the door, we can wedge it open even more.
Yeah, as long as that's not as far as the door opens.
No, well, I mean, I see other companion pieces. Yeah, I mean, actually, Secret River wasn't at the forefront of my mind when I was reading this. I actually was thinking a lot of Stephen Gapp's book, Sydney Wars, because obviously with talking about, you know, this is the frontier area, and also Auntie Julie Jansen's book, Benevolence.
Which is wonderful. Highly recommended, people.
And so I see these as sort of like, unofficial companion pieces. I can just kind of read across all of them and get like a really good appreciation of the history in the area. So just some more questions here, particularly focusing on Dyarubbin. So there was a question about the meaning of Dyarubbin. I think it's probably important to talk about the meaning of the word. What does that word mean?
It's related to yams because in Gurungurra, which is one of the local languages, Dyarubbin is the yam. And that makes total sense because that's the staple food. The riverbanks and the river flats are rich in all kinds of yams. So I'm using yam as a generic word for many kinds of roots, bulbs, rhizomes, and also the stems of some of the lagoon type plants, the emergence. It's the staple food. There are rock carvings of yams, not many, but quite a few. And it's the core thing that one of the core things that people are fighting for when they successfully at one point get rid of the settlers for about 6 years around Sackville Ridge. Yeah. So yams are at the core of this. It's also why I think women-led bands come and take the corn when it grows where the yam beds were, because they regard it as their country, the fruit of their country, and it's theirs. So that's one of the areas where there is a lot of frontier conflict about the corn raids, but they see them as the equivalent of yams. So Dyarubbin, yams. There's also a word in Darkinjung, which is very similar, which means creek. So as in a lot of Aboriginal words, the meanings cross over. There can be metaphoric and literal at
Yes.
the same time. But we have a lot of words like that in English as well.
Well, that's true as well. There was a question, an earlier one, about including Irish convicts in the book as well. So
Sure.
yes, because I know you talk about all the different, the convicts. You got the freemen settlers as well. But yeah, it's interesting to delve even further about Irish.
Yeah, everybody likes Irish convicts. There were some. It depends where you were. So one area I looked at intensively was Castlereagh, and the reason I looked at that was because it's gone. It's gone for an open cut gravel mine, which is just sad because it was so beautiful. There weren't many Irish convicts there. There were a lot of people from the south of England, from the rural areas, not many from the north. If you go up from McDonald, strong Catholic communities and beautiful churches that they built. I don't know how they did because they were really poor. But yes, and what I also found was that they stuck together and they're quite quiet. They didn't mingle with a lot of the English. They kind of stuck together. They, were sponsors for each other's babies at baptisms. They were witnesses at weddings and best men and best women. And they carried the coffins of their friends to their burial place. So there was a bit of information about that. But where they weren't very numerous, you don't learn much about them. And, even in Penrith, there wasn't a Catholic church, I think, till the 1840s. And even then it was just a slab thing. It was a slab building. So it's really interesting. So the story is different depending on where you go on the river. It's a big, long river.
Yes, it is. It certainly is, yes. So just some of the more questions that we've got. So I think a lot of them are touching on what we've discussed. So there's one about baby farming. So because we were talking about with the taking of children. And yes, and
so baby farming is something I associate with much later in the 19th century, and it was pretty gross. So basically people let babies die, unwanted babies die. So I'm not sure what that question is about. Maybe adoption?
Maybe just adoption because
children are highly valued in this period. The convict settlers had come out of a country where, the statistics on infant deaths was horrendous. They couldn't support their children. Can you imagine what it's like to come here and have enough food for everybody? They're not going to starve. The climate's beautiful and people are restored to health so that they can have babies. That would have been a miracle for them. Absolute miracle. And I've also found in my earlier work on the rocks and also the earlier book, The Colony, that people readily adopted children who had no parents or whose parents were in jail or had to leave. Children were really highly valued.
Karen asks, as a historian currently formulating her PhD topic and having a personal interest, with James Roos being a 5 times great-grandfather, Karen was wondering what sources you use to get the detail on First Nations people and the convicts aside from the Reverend's notes.
Well, you could look in my book at the footnotes.
I swear the footnotes, I swear they start almost, halfway through the book.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. There is a lot of information just reading through the standard historical records of Australia, through the Sydney Gazette, through all the early letters and reports that have been published or not published. There are stacks of reports, unpublished manuscripts in the library. It's a matter of spending a very long time gleaning through, reading it all and just gleaning through details. It's also like a jigsaw puzzle. You will not find a whole file on First Nations people. You have to glean it from tiny details and build it up from that. And the reason I did that is because it's a very important story to recover. So yes, if you have a look at the book, you'll see the kinds of references and sources that I use. There's also things like what we call the blanket lists.
Yes, the blanket lists.
Yeah, the blanket lists from the 1830s, which actually list the Aboriginal people, not all of them, but the ones who wanted to get a blanket from a centre like Windsor. And there's actually names on there, actual names of individual people. So again, the story isn't lost, but we have to go find it. We have to think laterally about where that information would be. Mm-hmm. We have to decolonise our thinking when we're reading it, trying to think about it from the other side of the frontier.
We've got a question from Anna. Have any of the Aboriginal groups or communities you've spoken to highlighted concerns about the future of the Hawkesbury estuary, and if so, which ones?
Not Not the Hawkesbury estuary itself. I'm so sorry, Anna. That's such a good question. I'm sure they would be because they're very interested in country. Mostly what I've been talking about with them is language, archaeological sites, and the ones that they themselves discover, and very current concerns like youth suicide and training Aboriginal people, young Aboriginal people for leadership, which is what they need. And also my university is very supportive of all these measures to get more Aboriginal students at university to support them while they're there. So I haven't really got an answer, but let's talk about that when we meet.
Yes, great. So just wondering about time, how we going. Yeah, so if we've got some more questions, please we'll just scroll through if that's possible. We can have a look at some more questions that are coming through. Oh yeah, so yeah, I think I did see one earlier about your writing process and your research process. I mean, there's a lot of you know, people aspiring to undertake such amazing research like you have, and you know, with hopes of maybe writing it down to something like this. What sort of advice would you have for people undertaking this sort of research?
Don't give up. I think one of my maxims with this book is it takes as long as it takes, which is not very conducive to university culture, but still, you have to believe in what you're doing and you have to be excited by it. If you're bored by it, you're never going to be able to do it. It's almost like a detective story, what I was doing, because there are hidden histories there, and I know how important they are, and I know how important it is to spend the time doing that research and talking to people, of course, and going on country and bringing that all together. Also multiple sources like maps and images and archaeology and language. History isn't just about documents, it's about everything that's relevant. So think as widely as you can, I think, and yeah, just don't give up. Yeah.
And so much is digitised now too, like all the sort of references you were talking about before, a lot of that is now becoming more and more available. So it's such a difference from, I guess, being a historian in decades past, where it's living and breathing in those libraries and things.
I do that too, and I love that. Oh yeah, not everything is online, but a lot is. But you know, online is fantastic for things like if you want to find out about the forests that Aboriginal people lived in and that settlers came to. A lot of this, the information about the species, the trees and plants and what they like and what they don't like, that's all online and it's all authoritative. You know, be careful online. There's a lot of crap online too.
Yes.
So, you know, you're right. There are so many fantastic sources that make the research getting out of documents and into ecology or geology or whatever available. And there's a lot of wonderful experts out there that I am eternally grateful to for helping me with this.
That's great. I know it's like trying to ask who's your favourite child, but is there a particular story in here that is a favourite or one that just really sticks with you?
Oh,
I'm just going to put you on the spot.
Yeah, put you on the spot, Mariko. Thanks for that. Well, now Dawn, obviously, you know,
yes,
I wrote the essay about her. She's incredible. And to me, unpacking her story and her words was very moving and very satisfying because I finally figured out what she was telling Sarah Shand. And it's the most incredible revelation, you know, that this old Aboriginal woman who's in her 90s survived the invasion, survived everything, and she's still singing country, and she still believes in traditional beliefs about, you know, the Blue Mountains and Devil and all those sorts of things. So she's one of my favourites, definitely. But I've got some ex-convict favourites as well, but you have to read the book to read about those.
Oh yes, so yeah, we're not going to reveal all the secrets here tonight. So yeah, please go out to your favourite bookshop and purchase this. Yes. With the NAIDOC theme this year, so always will be Aboriginal land. How do you feel, Grace? How can we influence others to appreciate like an Aboriginal Australia?
That's such a good question, isn't it? Well, NAIDOC Week itself is fabulous for raising awareness. I think just by talking to people, not in an aggressive way, but just discussing, did you know? And going on country is always great too, because it makes a lot more sense if you've read about something, like you've done some research on rock art or you've read some of the books that you just mentioned, and you go to the place, and it makes sense. And going in a group would get people talking. I would like it to be normal for us to talk about Aboriginal culture as part of our history and part of our culture. I mean, it's being offered to us. It's awfully generous of people. It's also extremely complex.
Yes.
So when I say Aboriginal culture, that's even a silly thing to say because, how many languages are there? 500? And so many different groups. But I do see that groundswell of interest and support and a longing to do something about it.
That's it, and I think it's about mobilising that interest into action.
Yeah.
I think that's something that, it's all very well and good, and I think it's great to have the interest, but like, what can we do to build a, better shared future?
Well, we need leadership from our politicians. That would be a start. If they ratified the early research from the heart and started working on that, maybe funding some local truth-telling projects, that would be awesome.
That would be.
I think possibly the team that I've been working with on the Real Secret River Dyarubbin project could be a model for doing this in other regions. So that would work well.
Yeah, because I think I've seen this another question by Melinda talking about, I'm just going to paraphrase it a bit about, this project and how it was such a really great collaborative effort between yourself and also the Daru community. Looking at how this could be a really good example of how to do these sort of projects and, inspire these sort of initiatives and the sharing of expertise and knowledge. Yes.
Yeah. So that question is about, I'm assuming this is about our project. Was this an act of reciprocity for the Daru elders? Yes, it was. We designed this project together. They immediately wanted to do it. And so we sat down and designed it. We put in a funding application. We won, which was fab. And we do everything together. Everything's, checked and run past.
Yeah.
It's quite complex because we have an archaeologist, a linguist, lots of bushwalkers, local historians, and now the mapping people working on our project. So I'm kind of the coordinator person. But yeah, we do everything together.
No, it's a great model of how to do these sort of research projects. But all too often you see ones that are like non-Indigenous people writing these histories, and they are just like from such a water and arm's distance away from the community they're writing about.
Well,
and
yeah.
Yes,
that's why we have to. I think archaeologists have led the way with this. I don't know if people are aware of this, but they were the first one to encounter the facts of, the fact that our practice was colonizing. It was going on with colonizing, and they were the ones that came up with ways to work equally with Aboriginal people to give them back their stories after the research had been done. And hats off to them because they really showed the way of how this can be done.
Yes, that's great. So I think we'll start wrapping up soon, but I just wanted to ask, I think there's a good question from Di that talks about like the national curriculum, and I think it's really important to talk about like of education. I think it all comes down to truth telling and being able to better appreciate Aboriginal people and culture. It really does, I think from a young age, people need to learn through the education, through the education system. What can we learn from books like yours? I mean, it'd be good to see this on, maybe not on the primary school curriculum. But
that'd be cool.
But it would be great to see, more stories like this, ways that early childhood educators up to university level, how can we teach some of these stories and lessons of the past? I mean, can't I tell a story about, learn about the past so you don't repeat the past.
Absolutely. Well, I'm hoping that my work will feed into everything, really. I mean, the school education, that is a great point. School education is really important. It would be great if kids could learn the history and culture and language of their local Aboriginal people, because often I find, because it's a national curriculum or a state curriculum, it's all homogenous. And it's really quite dull because it's a homogenous story which could be about anywhere and isn't about anywhere. Do you know what I mean? So if kids could learn from stories that we're uncovering with the Real Secret River project about their own area and their own landmarks and their own sites, surely, and own languages, it surely would make more sense to them and be more normal to them. Whereas at the moment, I'm not sure. I'm not an expert on this. This is just from talking to my Darra colleagues who are teachers and are themselves working on doing just what's being suggested here. They publish books with Magdala Press, which publishes Indigenous history, which do a great job. So yeah, there's hope there too. But it's a big job.
It's a big job.
Yeah.
Well, I think that might be just a good way to finish off this session, and some really great food for thought about that local approach. And I encourage all of you to not just read Grace's book, People of the River, Lost Worlds of Early Australia, but also think about engaging with your local Aboriginal community and learning more about the Aboriginal heritage and history of your local area.
Yep.
So that's
that's great. That's a great way to finish.
And I'd just like to thank Professor Grace Karskens for joining me tonight, and the Hornsby Shire Library staff, who are once again just done an amazing job with pulling this event together, getting the tech, it looks great. So yes. Yes, all of you listeners here tonight who signed up, 200 over, nearly 300 odd, like a really big number. And I'd like to thank, Library for promoting this event, but also groups such as Hornsby Area Residents for Reconciliation, HA, who've also put the word out. I know a lot of you are listening tonight. So I think I'd just like to wrap it up and thank you again, Grace.
And I'd like to thank you, Mariko. I'm just honoured and privileged to be interviewed by you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much.
And thank you to everybody who attended.